fooled me once. Shame on you. It fooled me. We can't get fooled again.
All right, welcome everyone to Reframing the Narrative, episode 6. And this week we are doing something a little different because we've had some feedback from our audience that they just want to get to know PJ and DJ a little bit more. And so we're doing a chat amongst friends and just doing a little bit of a brain dump of what we've seen and observed over the past week or so since we convened last week. And we're fairly certain that this will take a certain direction, but as you've probably observed by now, every conversation takes its own organic turn. So we'll just see where it goes, and hopefully you enjoy the ride. So, Jake, nice to see you again.
Good to be back. Episode 6. We're rolling along, keeping our schedule. That's all we guarantee around here.
Loving it. And so I know that you were thinking over the past couple of days about at least a starting point for this conversation, kind of building off that idea of where we're paying our attention. Maybe I'll just hand it to you to kind of get some thoughts out there, and we'll build off of that baseline.
Okay. Well, thanks for throwing the hot potato in my lap first. So off air, I just mentioned this notion that popped into my head just shortly before we got together for this recording. And that's the idea of, well, I was thinking about the Super Bowl and what is a bowl? A bowl is a container. And when so many people are focused on something like the Super Bowl and all doing the same thing, all watching the same thing with their eyes, there's a lot of energy that is directed into that bowl. And so it's holding that energy. And so the idea of directed energy, whether weaponized or not, kind of popped into my head. And I don't want to belabor all the great analyses that I've seen out there. The expectation is that there's this satanic ritual among a certain set of people who are maybe a bit cynical about the people who aspire to run things around the world or across the world. And there are a lot of expectations. And so no matter what happens, I think people are going to make something, they're going to read into whatever they see, or they're going to make something out of it, even if it's a nothing burger in a way. But I did notice a few things about the Super Bowl. I do continue to see this idea that I've picked up on, that this Trump number 47 administration is really patterning itself off of the Roman Empire and the Pax Romana. And there's a bit of that at play in the idea of the expansion of Rome. At the same time, there was a lot of hardline tyranny and authoritarianism within Rome that kept the people in line. And even giving the soldiers outside conquests to busy themselves with kind of kept them away from being involved in internal affairs.
You ever heard of the Masada? For 2 years, 900 Jews held their own against 15,000 Roman soldiers. They chose death before enslavement. And the Romans, where are they now?
You're looking at him, asshole.
And we're seeing exactly what Trump promised when he gave that inauguration speech. And we're seeing some of the things he promised in the sense that he's dismantling some DEI programs. A lot of people have made a big deal about USAID and some of the, frankly, very absurd programs. They're finding money in certain places.
If you look at the waste and abuse that has run through USAID over the past several years, these are some of the insane priorities that organization has been spending money on.
USAID gave money to a transgender clinic in India.
$6 million to fund tourism in Egypt, $20 million on a new Sesame Street show in Iraq, $70,000 for a production of a DEI musical in Ireland, $4.5 million to combat disinformation in Kazakhstan,
$122 million of that to groups aligned with foreign terrorist organizations.
$47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, $2 million for sex changes in Guatemala, $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. I don't know about you, but as an American taxpayer, I don't want my dollars going towards this crap.
I always ask, like, why are we learning about that kind of stuff? Why are we being pointed to this or that? Oh, there, gotcha, when there's even bigger gotchas. And I'm going to give credit to our friend Peggy Hall for really doing a bit of a gotcha when it came to Elon Musk and saying, well, is Elon taking control of so many different aspects of administration, kind of getting him off the hook for all the ways that he was being put in the hot seat and investigated in the last years and months, including things like just false advertising when it comes to the ability of Teslas to drive themselves.
Mr. Talcove, do you know how many inspector generals at agencies that were investigating Elon Musk's companies have been fired by the Trump-Musk administration?
No.
It is 5. Ms. Royal, the inspector general of the Department of Labor had 17 open investigations into Tesla and SpaceX. Do you know what the Trump-Musk administration did to that inspector general?
No.
They fired him, and I think y'all know. Mr. Whitson, the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation was investigating Tesla. Do you know what the Trump-Musk administration did to that Inspector General?
No.
They were fired. The Department of Defense's Inspector General was looking into SpaceX. Mr. Hedler, do you know what the Trump-Musk administration did to that Inspector General?
I believe he was fired.
So asking myself, what's really going on while we're paying that attention to particular things? I think Trump told us right out at the very beginning, this is a country that is going on the rampage. We are going into a phase of expansion. And at the same time, we're seeing all the introduction of these AI programs. And personally, I've been in contact with the workings of the AI industry. I won't go into in what capacity, but it's being implemented at warp speed, if you forgive the borrowing of that phrase. So what does it mean? Are we being distracted while they're implementing this at home? Or are we being distracted by all the things in the news, such as, are we losing our confidence in civil aviation? Or will that allow a vacuum of confidence for the introduction of self-flying planes, or maybe getting rid of air traffic controllers? I always ask myself, if that attention is being directed and that energy being directed towards something, what are we missing at the same time? Are we missing anything? Maybe we're not. Maybe that is the whole story, but that's where I am right now. And that's kind of a long-winded introduction to where I am.
That's awesome. Thanks for that, Jake. And I have so many comments from that introduction. So let me just piggyback a little bit, and I'll just say I'll take the bait. There's some things that I saw in the Super Bowl that I just have to get out. Certainly, the halftime ritual, at first glance, I can't say that it was completely obvious to me what was being communicated. But then after reflecting on what I just saw, there was clear symbolism for the U.S. and, very patriotic U.S.-based theme. But what I found interesting is that at the end of the ceremony, there was some signage that said "Game Over," and it got me wondering: are they trying to communicate that that's the end of the U.S. as we know it, or part of this golden age expansion? It could go a number of different directions. So hard to say there, but I think that's what I took away from it. And I personally haven't spent time looking at all the different analyses and speculation there, but basically, yeah, was that just kind of previewing the the acceleration of the NWO and movement away from national sovereignty. It's an open question. That may have been what was communicated, but then as I was thinking about it more, there's the obvious symbolism of the Eagles versus the Chiefs, and perhaps that's a wink and a nod to the Grand Masonic experiment that started in 1776, officially overtaking the native world that was here, or you might even say the old world. And I know that many of our listeners are keen on the intentional covering over and destruction of the world that existed before the new one sprung up, even though there are still physical structures today that definitely point to a prior past that wasn't in the history books we grew up with. So I do wonder if the trouncing of the Chiefs, which no one really expected, was also part of the symbolism that, this new grand Masonic experiment known as the U.S., perhaps that was just its way of saying that we're here and things are going to be different. But that's maybe just taking things a step or too far. But that was just my interpretation. But even more so, just thinking on that theme a little bit more, I was watching a video by Martin Liedtke of British Flat Earth. He does some great work, and he just happened to pop in my feed today, and he did a short episode looking at the narratives around World War II and how so much of that didn't make sense. And I think many people in our community would say that one of the big goals of World War II was to wipe out evidence of the prior world, the old world, if you will. Perfect case in point was the destruction of Dresden, which had no warlike motives or reason to be bombed into oblivion as it was. So I just wonder, was some of what we saw in the Super Bowl a hint towards that wiping out of the old world and old world order and the establishment of the new one? And then perhaps with the halftime, it was saying things are moving to the next chapter. I'm just going to do a quick aside as I'm thinking about this more and more. Just people who have watched John Levy, for example, will have no doubt seen his work on Mount Rushmore and how it looks as though there were at least a couple faces that were wiped off from the original set of faces. So I think the ancient Native American or whatever we would attribute the prior civilization to being, that there were actually 6 fathers, I think is what the native tongue indicated for what was up there. And obviously there's, I think, four presidents now that are commemorated by Mount Rushmore. So, just more of the erasing of the prior world. And, could these things all be related? Perhaps, but that's just my best interpretation. I haven't spent hours rewinding and pausing things and looking for hidden symbols, but just going on the exoteric and thinking about the esoteric, that's what I came up with.
That's all good stuff. So, PJ, there's one more point about the Super Bowl that came to mind as I was watching. I actually counted the number of dancers that were symbolizing the American flag, obviously. There were 50 plus Kendrick. And I couldn't help but think, what's going on today with talking about absorbing Greenland and Canada? So it's kind of like a 50 plus 1. What is the next step? Is this a grand chessboard? Are they going to add another piece? I haven't seen anybody really echoing that. I haven't been crawling all the different podcasts and the internet for anybody else's take on that. That's just my personal little angle on what I observed at that point when I was watching the Super Bowl and cheating on my disciplined diet with some cookies and chips. Did you notice that too?
I did not. That's a really astute observation, and perhaps it just goes towards the idea of game over for the U.S. as we know it. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. I
did notice, and I'm not the first, some symbolism that was in common between the halftime show and the Squid Game. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was a movie, Korean movie that was also turned into a TV show, and the movie was about basically one of those battle royale type, very dystopian situations where people are in tremendous debt and they really have no way out and no other choice, at least in conventional terms. And we know that you always have a choice, but sometimes it doesn't always feel that way. So they're desperate. That's what they have in common. And they sign up for this game, and the ground rules are essentially it's every man for himself, and alliances do form, but in the end it's just winner takes all, and there's a huge pot of money that comes in a golden piggy bank that comes down from the sky. And the guards are dressed in kind of pink fuchsia uniforms, and they wear masks, and they have triangles, circles, and squares, and that denotes their ranks. And the same symbols are shared by the PlayStation controller. So the term controller kind of popped into my head. So the ranks in Squid Game are the circle, triangle, and square. Circles denote the lowest rank. They're just basically the lowest soldiers. The triangle masks denote armed guards. They have the power of using violence and the threat of violence over the contestants. And the square masks are higher authorities or decision makers. And you can make a lot out of things like triangle. And typically, it's stable. There's a base. It's a hierarchy. There's even the all-seeing eye. You see more of things if you're at the top of the triangle or pyramid. Of course, there's a whole bunch of things that can be associated with those various symbols. But I found it interesting that Squid Game and PlayStation are both games, and it shares a similarity with other winner-take-all, essentially dystopian scenarios like the Hunger Games. And the contestants in Squid Games are all in debt. So what is it saying? Is there some kind of symbolism as far as that goes? Like, people are always talking about the national debt and saying that we're responsible for that, or personal debt. What's the way out? Trump is even talking about auditing the Federal Reserve, believe it or not. Is that for real? Or is it just another way to introduce some kind of a solution? Because we know about the Hegelian dialectic, and is that going to get people to jump on board and say, yeah, we want to end the Fed? Well, what's the solution? It's always easy to oppose something and say, this isn't working out, or it's antiquated, or it's bad, it's nefarious, but what's your solution? And that's where people get stumbled. So I found that kind of interesting. And I also noted West Coast time was very interesting. At the very beginning, just before they started and had the kickoff of the Super Bowl, they did the usual LA strong, NC strong, NOLA strong, kind of like a live vigil, which I'm sure it was recorded in advance because it looked like it was nighttime. But Lady Gaga was playing piano inside a circle of protection, which is kind of a witchy thing. And that whole little program that they had honoring the fallen, which echoes ritual sacrifice to me, began at 3:33 p.m. West Coast time. I don't know if that's because it was just a coincidence or not, but it's fun being a coincidence theorist, I must say. On the East Coast, where the game started, it was already 6:33, so make of it what you will. But I just looked at my watch. I was like, isn't the kickoff scheduled now? And they're going to Lady Gaga. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But they never let a good crisis go to waste, so they at least got some airtime out of that.
I would have missed this point before, but the Masonic symbolism was definitely apparent to me the minute I tuned in. And I have to admit that I skipped by a lot having this on DVR and going past the initial set of programming and commercials and what have you. But I noticed that the person who took the initial kickoff and returned it, it was either for a touchdown or for a long gain. I don't remember now, but that person happened to be number 33. And I was like, oh, isn't that convenient? So the first major play of the game, guy's number was 33, but I want to say that the guy who took the opening kickoff was the same guy. So 33 played a prominent role. And then once the game settled in, I noticed that the announcer said this was Andy Reid's 33rd season in the NFL. And I was like, isn't that funny? So, right in our face once again. I definitely did not miss that. So, they've got to flash their gang signs wherever they can.
Yeah, always.
But, you had mentioned the idea of consent, and I think that's something for us to touch on again because, and I should mention to our listeners that DJ and I had collaborated on our first of what we hope will be many Substack posts, and we'll be providing information to find that Substack as well as our new YouTube channel towards the end of this broadcast. But that being said, the piece that we worked on together, we talked about how consent is so key in so many of these things. And, even as you mentioned, us turning on the TV and taking this in was our consent to whatever symbolism they threw our way or subliminal programming, which we know that's a thing and has been for a long time. So where we give our attention and power really, really matters. And you brought up the mask issue and the reason that 2020 dragged into today. I'm still amazed when I see people walking around voluntarily with the face gag on. That is a consent thing, and none of this would have happened if everyone would have stood up and said, no, that's ridiculous. We're not doing that. Whether that's the constriction of breathing or whether that's, putting God knows what into your arm. It's all consent. And, it's like the classic analogy that you have to allow the vampire into your home before it could do damage. You have to say yes to these things. So I think that's something really worth digging into a little bit in context of a lot of this, as we mentioned, even with some of these narratives that are flying around on TV, how much we want to engage with them is really our decision.
It is. And I was just thinking today about how far our world has come towards just directing our attention towards gadgets and technology, whereas it used to be face-to-face. I saw a graphic that showed the percentage of time that people spent interacting with family, with friends, going to events and things like the pub and social occasions, interacting with colleagues or reading, and it had spending time online at the very bottom. And as the years went closer to today, what really struck me was family time was like 70%. And this is only like mid 20th century. And by the time we got to maybe 10, 15 years ago, family had even been superseded by colleagues, just spending time hanging out with people at work over family time, and internet time or online time by far superseded everything. And I was thinking back to a friend of mine who was waiting at a bus stop once and met this lovely lady, and they're now empty nesters with 2 children out of college and with careers and everything, because they were not looking at their devices. The opportunities that we let go by when we are devoting our attention to a particular thing or something that we should maybe remind ourselves of. We should keep that in mind, let alone if you're looking down at your phone while crossing the street, you might not have it tomorrow.
Yeah, well said. I mean, even the idea of your employment that, you're trading your valuable hours of a day for, as we talked about last week, something that's illusionary, right? Like it's money is necessary for the things that we have in the world, but in and of itself, it's not even real. And those are hours that you'll never get back. So again, it's opening the door for whatever that vampire might be, and, agreeing to the terms. You had an interesting comment on clicking, consenting terms. I don't know if you want to maybe expand your thoughts on that a little bit.
Yeah, just think about when you click on a form, it often will always have terms and conditions. I got something notarized recently, and just to get to the part where I'm able to sign it, I had to scroll all the way through all these terms and conditions that I didn't read. So that's a common thing. When you sign up for an app or download an app, you have to agree to terms and conditions a lot of times, or software. And so you're engaging in some kind of a give and take, a transaction. And a lot of times we either ignore or are unaware of, or even we don't even have a means to discover what those trade-offs are. So you're consenting to certain rules or limitations and obligations that have consequences. So what did you agree to when you signed something? Or what did you agree to when you even turned on the TV to a particular channel? Those are all things that we're doing because we are directing our attention towards those, and we want something. And when you want something and you agree to certain terms, that's an exchange, it's a transaction. And we're surrounded by those in our lives. We're just full of those. And so the question that just comes to mind is really like, what is the price that you're paying? You've referred back to what was going on in 2020 when people were directed to certain solutions that may not have been really solutions, but because there was fear involved, then certain actors took advantage and they stepped in where we weren't giving our consent to people that were maybe to a certain sector of the population who fancied themselves awake. We weren't paying our attention or giving our consent to that portion, the overtly nefarious. But then there are other actors that kind of step in and they're taking advantage, and they're seeking control in maybe equally nefarious forms that we're just not aware of because they're not so overt. Or maybe they're just trying to enrich themselves. But all of these transactions are everywhere in our modern age and modern society. And it's something to think about whenever you're directing your attention towards something, whenever you feel like you want or need something, what is the price that you pay?
Well said. And, just listening to you talk there made me think about that clip in Money is Debt where they show that just the act of a signature creates money. Not only does it put you on the hook for paying back this imaginary money, but it in turn creates 9 times or more of this funny money out of thin air. And it is a commitment that you have literally put your name to that debt and then created more debt for the world. And it is something worth thinking about. And, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go there in the discussion about the Super Bowl and Kendrick Lamar, but I think it's worth, and credit to Good Fight Ministries. They did a whole dissection of him and what he stands for. And for those who haven't seen their famous documentary from years ago, They Sold Their Soul for rock and roll. It's definitely worth watching. It is a little bit heavy-handed at times, but I think there's some really good points made there. And their most recent one about Kendrick, I think, made the same points that they made in They Sold Their Soul for rock and roll, which is, people who sell themselves in some way spiritually for material gain and this thing we call money and all of that. What are they trading, really, and what are they getting in the end? And, you have to look at some of these people, like I'll take Bob Dylan, for example. And interestingly enough, there's a movie coming out that's idolizing him. And if things were so great for him, why is he at his age still doing what he's doing. And, there's the famous interview from 60 Minutes where he said, I'm just holding up my end of the bargain.
I made a bargain with it, a long time ago, and I'm holding up my end.
What was your bargain?
To get where I am now.
Should I ask who you made the bargain with?
with the chief commander.
On this earth?
And on this earth, and then in a world we can't see.
And you look at a lot of these people, even people who thought they had it all figured out, like Anton LaVey or, people of that nature. Many of them on their deathbed or close to it have many regrets when they realize that they've traded away their life and their soul for something that's meaningless in the broader context.
I also found it interesting, just to get back to the Super Bowl. I'm not familiar with Kendrick Lamar. I had no expectations. But Lady Gaga recently released a song called Abracadabra, and although she performed a different song at the Super Bowl pregame performance called Hold My Hand, she referred to the Super Bowl as sports or spells. And so it's like right out there in front of you. And even MSN had an article, Serpents, Rituals in Tay Voodoo, inside the spiritual backdrop behind Super Bowl 59. And it talks about Taylor Swift and the magic spells and voodoo that she has cast upon maybe the Swifties and even devotees of the Kansas City Chiefs. And it's just interesting that it's breaking kind of into the mainstream, this idea of casting spells and voodoo. Of course, the Super Bowl was held in New Orleans, which is famous for ritual and voodoo. But I thought that was really interesting that things are breaking into the mainstream consciousness now, getting back to probably 99% of the country and the world is unaware that the Federal Reserve isn't federal and it has no reserves. What happens when that awareness reaches people? For instance, when Trump says we're going to get Ron Paul to audit the Fed, is this just another ruse? Is this just a way to get somebody working for him that would normally be opposed to him and then ensure his failure? Or is there something else in mind? But what happens when we pay our attention towards that? Maybe we can consciously remind ourselves to bring it in a good direction. This is a point that I've been thinking about a lot. We attribute a lot of nefarious intentions and maybe even deliberate actions to things that maybe just we can't really explain, similar to the idea that, well, somebody got sick, there must be a mechanical kind of an action that took place, some kind of a pathogen that jumped from the bathroom doorknob into somebody's mouth and then down into their lungs and then became some kind of a respiratory infection. But maybe sometimes it's just that there is a mass energy and it directs on individual levels and then it directs on mass levels, and we're tapping into that. So I guess my point would be that there are so many things that we can't explain and that haven't been explained adequately or at all, and then only explained or understood according to the instruments that we have when they are physical particles or forces, such as measuring wind or looking into a microscope at bacteria or things that we can actually analyze. But then there are countless things that we cannot even detect with our instruments. There are probably forces at play that we haven't even imagined exist because we can't quantify them, we can't analyze them. So I wonder how much of that invisible world is at play in things like numerology and just the way energies find an order, kind of like taking a magnet to metal filings there's a force at work, and those physical things, they take an order, they follow an arrangement. So I'm really intrigued by the idea that there is an order, whether it's what some would say is this holographic universe of our own making, or something that really just can't be explained. But on a mass level and an individual level, there are forces that we deliberately and unconsciously affect and order by our thoughts and by our fears and by our hopes, and things like prayer as well. Maybe that's just because there's an unexplored and unappreciated energy that ties things together that's at work. And it's not always just these nefarious people that plan it all out. They're just like, ha ha ha, I'm just going to run the numbers here and we'll see, and we'll get the conspiracy theorists going crazy trying to figure out the code here. But maybe nature and God has a code, and we're barely aware of it. Just like radio signals are flying around, there's all sorts of transmissions going on that we cannot perceive ourselves unless we tune into them.
Yeah, some really great comments there. And I would just say that, one, I think it's definitely intentional with some of the people that you called out, like Lady Gaga or Taylor Swift. I think both of them have publicly admitted that they were into some form of witchcraft or, spell casting. And, many in the mainstream media or the like would say that that's harmless and it's no big deal. But those of us who are more aware of the fact that we live in a multidimensional world that includes a spiritual world all around us realize that that's not child's play, and it's something that is very dangerous, and we're ill-equipped to deal with it. And, my comment further would be that thinking about where a lot of the power structure flows down to, ultimately it does come from the mystery religions that go all the way back to the Tower of Babel. And before then, that, there is a lot of this esoteric knowledge that was given to man from Nephilim and corrupt spirits that wanted to corrupt God's creation and mankind and give them some of this forbidden knowledge. I think that it's very unlikely that anyone actually sits in a room and goes, let's manipulate the score to be a certain thing, or, and maybe on some levels there could be some intention with that. But I think, when it comes to gematria, there's people who've spun themselves in cycles and wrapped themselves around the axle trying to figure out all these different numerology meanings. And I don't think that there's a human conscious intention with a lot of that. I think it just happens because it's part of the code that we don't understand. And I think that, after the flood, it's very likely that our eyes were shielded from a lot of what was around us that we perhaps could see in, the antediluvian times that we're intentionally shielded from today, and trying to tap into that is a game that no one wins. And I mentioned, Anton LaVey and Aleister Crowley was another one who had many regrets on his deathbed and was surprised about what he was seeing on his way out. So definitely not a world to be trifled with, even if it does seem like innocent child's play.
There's a power in the occult, which just literally means hidden. And it's deliberately hidden from us because there's an overlay of human control. And that's my interpretation about the world. We're being distracted, and there are powerful energies and tools available to us that are being obscured deliberately. But the most important device of all is the distraction and the obfuscation of God, because we can contact God without Bruce Springsteen or Taylor Swift's aid or Klaus Schwab's help. And we end up in this world very easily worshiping what we're given, and that being the physical realm and various actors in this realm. And I think back to like people you may have worshipped or the celebrities that you really looked up to or really enjoyed and admired back maybe decades ago. And where are they now? Or were they ever really that important? And were they really that great? Or some of them may have just been given to you. Some people probably even worship Milli Vanilli, right? So the point really being that there's this architecture of human doing that is built all around us, and it distracts us from really being in touch with a lot of important things, most of all our creator and what our purpose is here. And so you mentioned the spirituality, that aspect of it, and we definitely touch on the importance of that and having your relationship with the creator and not falling into the traps that are set for us, including various narratives.
Absolutely. And just thinking about some of the celebrities and where they are now, you know, all of their fame and fortune gone as they've passed on. You know, the old adage that you can't take it with you, I think rings true in all those cases. And many of those people who are still alive don't look entirely happy. So clearly, you know, consenting your time and energy towards those people who, as you mentioned, actually have in most cases been given to us and put on the stage intentionally, is not the best use of your time. And, you know, just opens up a little bit of a rabbit hole. I think something that let's say the past year that I've come to realize that some of those people that I thought were really new and innovative and talented and cutting edge when I was younger, and I look at how well they were supported and how, you know, I think many people who are into our world of looking into things and digging deeper will have come to realize that most of the pop songs in the world are written by like 2 or 3 people. And I think that was true for many of the people that in our generation we grew up idolizing. And I do think that that's, you know, if you look up to somebody as a hero, that's a form of idolatry, but that's my own viewpoint. Some of those people weren't even as talented. And I'll say that this is a controversial statement, but I've even come to realize that the Beatles were not as talented as most people think or have thought that they were. There's a great channel on YouTube called The Sage of Quay, and that guy has dedicated a lot of his time and energy into exposing it. And he didn't actually start down the path of wanting to expose it, but he had read the book by a former ancillary member whose name escapes me now, but there was a book where this guy had put some thoughts out into the world about how real the Beatles' success was and whether they wrote any of their material at all. And this gentleman on Sage of Quay has detailed a lot of the inconsistencies of timelines for them to have been performing and writing and doing everything that they were supposed to have done. And the fact that early on in their career, there's documentation in magazines and other interviews where many people have said they actually weren't that good of a live band. And it's just, I know this is a bit of an aside, but it's just evidence that many of the heroes that we've been given are fake in some way or completely, depending on the situation. And I think there's definitely direction we can take with that in future episodes, looking at some of the false heroes that we've been given, even outside of entertainment. There's been some great work done recently by Agent 131711 on.
Whoa, you got the whole name.
Yeah, props to him. But he did some great work on Pasteur and all the fraud that was involved in what now today many people take for granted is settled science, where it actually was quackery. And perhaps we'll look at that in future episodes. But certainly people have shaped their lives around going back to the idea of ritual and consent. The rituals that they did to animals that make no actual sense to what actually should have been science to determine whether something was making something else sick, or if some infectious agent was actually being passed on, when you actually look at how animals were tortured in what's called vivisection, which I'll let our listeners look that up because it gets quite grotesque. But needless to say, it was definitely a form of ritual and black magic, and that idea goes deep in many directions. But bring me back home, Jake. I've kind of gone on a little journey by myself, and hopefully everyone's still around listening.
Well, we definitely share an admiration for the Substack account of Agent, what is it? 13711, something like that.
Agent 131711. The man does some great work.
Agent 131711. Yes. It's fantastic work, and we both read that as much as possible. And I must say, it's certainly not blasphemy in my world to kind of feel underwhelmed by the Beatles. I just could never really understand what was supposed to be so genius about them. But it was one of those things. They were held out as the greatest thing. And if you were getting into music, you had to investigate. You had to just give their entire catalog a listen. When I was first listening to pop music, that was what I was presented with. And be careful what you wish for, as the title of my solo show, episode 3.5, was, if you're looking for a musical hero, it will emerge. It will be presented to you, and you will be inclined to find value in it and be impacted by it. So choose wisely. And just keep in mind the consent. You are consenting wherever you're paying your attention. You're consenting to some kind of a transaction or exchange or bargain. And sometimes it's a good one. They're not all bad.
Here, it's all about making wise choices. And I think that's part of why we're here on this world. So this might be a natural stopping point for this week's episode, unless you had additional thoughts, Jake. Otherwise, I think is building on the theme of, making good choices and thinking about truth and in your search, and all of that combined in where you pay your attention. We have a great guest lined up next week. Brian is a fellow truth seeker here in Central Texas, and well plugged into the community here. I think a lot of our listeners will enjoy hearing his take and his recent journey. I won't ruin the surprise, but I had a good chat with him this past weekend, and really excited to have him on next week. Jake, any parting thoughts? I know we also want to share our information about the new YouTube channel that we've got at Reframing the Narrative Podcast. We'll put some information up on the screen. Any other parting thoughts?
Well, we will be posting on our Substack, which will be Reframing the Narrative on Substack. We'll be either posting kind of tag team style or even collaborating, as you got the ball rolling on our first article, and I just kind of fleshed it out a little bit more, and we ended up with a bit of a theme that we echoed during today's conversation. But then other than that, we will be starting a Rumble channel as well, in case things happen on the main platform. So that'll be Reframing the Narrative Podcast as well, just to keep things consistent. And we are on Spotify as well, just as Reframing the Narrative. And I am Discerning Jake at Discerning Jake on YouTube, and on Twitter, or now it's called X, at Jake Discerning. And that's an underserved platform, but I do look to kind of grow our audience and our community on Twitter, and maybe even do some live streams there with people. Wherever you hang out, if you do come across our conversations and our presentations here at Reframing the Narrative, let us know where we can find you as well. We're not just plugging ourselves. We want to connect with people and expand the consciousness of everybody that doesn't just buy what they're sold all the time.
Well said. And of course, you can find content on the Central Texas Rabbit Hole on YouTube as well. And I will be working towards posting some individual content related to some of the topics that we cover on Reframing the Narrative podcast. So look for that in the future as well. But I think this has been a great discussion, very top of mind, and just getting some thoughts out there. And we'll bring Ryan in next week to talk about his recent journey and how seeking the truth led to his spirituality, and really looking forward to that conversation. So tune in next week for episode 7.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.